there, it's Silver. This is Voidigo. This is one that I've actually been playing for a little bit on and off while it was in early access, but now that it's had its big 1.0 update and is fully out, I figured it would be the perfect time to actually cover it. This is a roguelite. It's going for the sort of Binding of Isaac / Enter the Gungeon style, but with a lot of its own ideas. And so I know this is a really crowded genre, right? I've covered lots of them, so I know firsthand that it is a crowded genre, but sometimes in a genre like this, you find something that basically has like a neon sign over its head that says, "Play me, I'm different." And this is one of those rare examples where that happens. Voidigo is, although a roguelite, very unique in and of itself and doesn't really feel exactly like any other game in the genre and has a lot of its own identity. And because of this, it's just a joy to play because it's got so much personality and so much weird stuff about it. You'll find that almost everything in this game is just odd in some way. Just think of stuff you've seen in this genre before, but make it real weird. And that's basically Voidigo. It is extremely colorful. It's this vivid adventure of all these various characters through extremely weird and creative realms, fighting quite disturbing bosses, and actually hunting bosses. There's a specific mechanic involving this, and just fighting against the void in general and trying to survive. So the way it works is you will start a run by selecting a character, and you'll only have one character unlocked at first, although every time you beat a boss, both phases of a boss actually, by the way, you will gain these little void bits, and you can spend these bits on a couple of different things, including unlocking new characters to play as. And each character is very different from the other. They all have their own kind of gimmick. Each character has a selection of power-ups that they can start with, a sort of passive item that is unique to them that you can't get elsewhere, and informs the kind of gimmick that they have, as well as a selection of 3 or 4 different weapons to start with that I'm pretty sure are also unique to them. I have never found one of the starting weapons in a chest or anything, so I'm pretty sure this is the only way you can get them. So what all this means is that your choice of character is extremely important because they all play vastly differently from each other. The basic character is mostly about stomping things and having a lot of just sort of bread and butter things, stuff that's easy to understand and easy to do, but still good. So he is just a really good jack-of-all-trades character. And you've also got some others, though, like the character that uses a turret, and the turret actually holds your weapons, and you don't hold them, so it's like controlling 2 characters at once, with one set of controls being the character themselves, and the other set being making sure you're aiming the turret in the right direction and sort of nudging it along to make sure it has a good way to hit enemies while you can stay safe. So you can actually have your turret around the corner and shooting enemies with you hiding behind the corner and completely out of reach, because the turret does not take damage. So you can have it right in the middle of all the chaos and you just be hiding in the corner. And it's a difficult play style because it is like controlling 2 characters at once, but it is a fun character to play. And there's also others, like one that causes your shots to orbit you and completely changes how all your guns function as a result of that, making your builds have to be a lot different in order to allow for this sort of orbiting behavior of all your bullets and stuff. There are lots of different guns for you to find, about 50, I believe, and you have 2 different weapon slots. You can hold 2 different weapons at any given time, and there are ranged and melee weapons. Ranged weapons have ammo, all of them, even your starting weapons. There are no infinite ammo guns in this game, by the way. And melee weapons have durability, so they will lose durability as you actually smack things with them. And you can find these jars around the place. You can also buy them, and bosses drop them a lot and some other things of that nature, and these jars will restore ammo or durability to whatever weapon you're holding at the time you pick up the jar. So you don't have to worry about like specific weapon ammo or anything. It's just like a universal jar that refills whatever you're holding while you pick it up. And of course, as is necessary for this genre, you got a lot of items, a lot of passive items. Now, every game in the genre that uses the sort of passive items, the whole point is to make yourself overpowered, right? Like in The Binding of Isaac or Into the Gungeon, you want to get a really good synergizing combo of passive items to make yourself ridiculous, and that is very much the case in this game as well, but the passive items are all really strange. They're all very weird, and you got to make them work for you, but they're very powerful if you get a good playstyle going. So you've got stuff like, they're kind of in different categories. You've got stuff like buttons, which actually cause buttons to appear physically in the world that you can stomp for different effects. You've also got stuff like hands, which will do something every time you reload. You've got boots, which will stomp down with a specific attack every time you stomp something. You've also got bullet lotions. Yes, really bullet lotions. They will modify the bullets of all weapons in some way. You can turn your bullets into snakes, or turn them into bouncing frogs, or turn them into bats that swarm and home in on enemies, and various other things. There are all kinds of different bullet types, and they affect different weapons in different ways, because, you know, some weapons shoot arrows or lasers or some other more exotic things, and they all kind of interact with these bullet lotions in different ways, but they're all quite powerful. All weapons and items do have a rarity, all the way up to like legendary stuff, which glows orange, so be on the lookout for that. You'll also notice you don't have a dodge roll in this game. Instead, you have a jump. I mentioned stomping on stuff, and that's because stomping is actually a major gameplay mechanic. You don't have a dash or a roll. Instead, you jump up in the air, so you have to physically jump over projectiles and attacks in order to avoid them, and when you come down, you can actually land on enemies' heads or on buttons or on various other things, and you'll stomp them and do some damage to them, as well as sometimes stun them or other things, depending on what kind of enemy you hit. You can also press the jump button again right as you land on an enemy in order to jump back up in the air, and you can chain multiple stomps in a row and actually stomp several enemies and build up this chain. And there are several passive items you can get, including one that the main normal character starts with that unleashes various effects after you land from a chain stomp, depending on how many you got in the chain. And the one you start with is like this antimatter stomp that causes a big explosion that gets bigger and more powerful the more people you stomp before you actually land finally. It charges up your boots. It's a pretty cool effect, and it's very satisfying in combat. This means the combat in this game is very hectic. It's extremely colorful and bombastic and silly, but it's also very hectic and quite challenging. There are bullets all over the place. Enemies have all sorts of different attacks of various different shapes, and the game does a good job of putting the sort of red symbols on the ground that tell you where you shouldn't be standing, and these come in all sorts of different shapes, like circles and rectangles and squares, and even other shapes that have like spikes on them, which show you that that attack is going to take up that space and fire projectiles in a specific direction, so you got to pay attention to that kind of stuff, especially once you get later on in a run where everything gets a lot more complicated and difficult. But yeah, so definitely the combat in this game is just a blast because it's very fast-paced. You're bouncing off of people's heads and firing all sorts of really weird, creative weapons at enemies that have a load of different projectiles to throw at you, so everything is just constantly filling the screen. If you are not very good at reading busy games, this game is going to be kind of hard for you to play because it's so colorful and there's so much action happening and so many projectiles and stuff. It is a little bit easy to lose yourself. I personally find that the art style of the game emphasizes your character enough that I've never lost my character in the chaos. Like, I always know where I am. It's pretty easy to keep track of yourself, but at the same time, that's just what I think. If you have a bit of a harder time following very chaotic bullet hell games, this may be a bit of a difficult one for you just because of the amount of colorful, crazy stuff that's happening on screen at any given time. Now, I mentioned hunting bosses, and that's because this game has a bit of a unique mechanic in terms of its boss fights. You can actually fight the boss of a world like as soon as you get there, basically, but you won't be able to damage them. Instead of having a boss room where the fight takes place, the boss roams around the various rooms of the world, so it can be pretty much anywhere. And your goal is to find these things called beacons, which are these towers of light, and they are swallowed by the void, these sort of red and black prism shapes, and you gotta stomp on these prisms in order to get rid of the void and get the beacon back. And every boss's health gauge will have a bunch of locks on it that show how many beacons are in the level, and if the health gauge is underneath one of those locks, you can't damage that segment of it. So you've got to go through and find all the beacons, stomp all of them to light them back up, and then this will unlock the entire boss's health gauge, and you can actually finally fight them that way. While you're actually fighting a boss, it's pretty common for them to run away, like Monster Hunter style, so they may run and go take a nap in a different square that you gotta go find. So you may choose to actually damage the boss a little bit while you have it. Maybe you've only unlocked like half of its health gauge, so you can do some damage to it. You may choose to fight it for a while and then have it run away, and then go and finish it off later once you've found the rest of the beacons. Or you may choose to avoid conflict with the boss entirely and just find the beacons first and not damage it at all until you have the full health gauge available to you. Either way, you'll be hunting this boss through the levels and eventually defeating it. But once you deplete its health gauge completely, that's only the first phase. Every boss has a second phase where the void sort of takes it over. It becomes this new void form, and it does a lot of the same stuff that it originally did, but a lot more aggressively and much, much faster, as well as often having some new attacks based on what else it could do previously. So it just becomes a much more hectic and difficult fight in the second phase. Once you beat this void version, the boss will actually go down, and you'll be able to move on to the next world and do the whole thing again. But in every successive world, there are more rooms as well as more beacons, so there are more locks on the boss's health gauge that you have to release in order to be able to down them. This all eventually culminates in the Void itself, which is a very difficult fight. The Void is different from the previous world because it's very small. It only has a couple of normal enemies in it, but the boss is pretty much ever present and will hound you throughout the whole thing constantly, and there are only 4 beacons in this world, which is a lot less than the previous world, but in exchange for that, the boss summons Void puppeted versions of all of the bosses you've faced in that run up to that point, and it makes you fight all of them at once in one room. And it's extremely difficult. It gets really hectic really fast, and there are just storms of projectiles and melee attacks and fire and all kinds of crazy stuff happening because you've got all these bosses stuck in a room at once. Once you're able to actually beat them, you're still not done because now you actually have to fight the Void Puppeteer itself, which will have a crazy moveset based on the various different bosses that you faced up till that point on that run. And only once you're finally able to beat that version of the Puppeteer will you complete a run successfully. So it is a very difficult game in my opinion, but the cool thing is it's also got a load of difficulty options that you can choose before each run individually, so you're never stuck on one difficulty option. You get to choose what difficulty you want to play every time you start a new run, and it only applies to that run. This is a mechanic I really like. I think it's very smart. So you have a lot of different difficulties, like 6 or 7 different ones in this game, from calm all the way up to impossible, and everything after the rogue difficulty, which is sort of like hard, everything after that is locked until you start beating the harder difficulties, and then once you're able to complete runs successfully, you'll start unlocking successively more difficult versions with, of course, more advanced stuff in them and all that. So yeah, there's a lot of different difficulty options to use, which I think is cool because that's not exactly common for this genre to have that many accessible at all times. So I like the fact that you can choose whatever you want before each run. There are also, of course, a lot of other things you can find aside from enemies and bosses when you're exploring the worlds, like shops. And to this note, you'll find shards, which are these sort of diamond-shaped crystal thingies. And the interesting thing about these is they don't disappear if you let them lay on the ground, but they get less and less value over time. Because one shard is not actually one that you can spend. Instead, it's a progress and a bar. And once the bar fills up, that is 1 shard's worth of actual spending money. So you've got to collect a whole bunch of these things to fill up this bar and actually get total shards that you can use to buy things. So this means that you're encouraged to be very mobile in combat and constantly picking up the shards that drop from enemies and from destructible items and stuff, because the longer you let them lay on the ground, the less they're worth. You'll also find some pretty cool stuff like these interior environments you can go into that have various challenge rooms in them. Once you enter one of these buildings, you're stuck in it, you can't escape, but you can choose to skip it if you don't like the options available, but if you do that, it destroys the building once you get out of it, so you don't get a second choice. But instead, you can choose to do these various challenges that will reward you with different items or choices of various upgrades or some things like that. But each of these challenge rooms will have something special about it that makes it more difficult. Like, of course, you can only move while the light is green. It will actually start to turn red and you'll have to stop. And there's a modifier called drywall that makes it to where all attacks can actually pierce walls and stuff, which the levels in this game are destructible, which is a really cool feature. All of it is like completely destructible. Even the areas that look like the borders of the level can actually be blown up. But not every attack can destroy walls. Only like explosive or particularly powerful attacks and charges and things can blow up walls and cover and the like. So normally you don't have to be too careful about that, but in these drywall challenges, everything blows them up. You'll also notice that all of your passive items have a star rating, usually anywhere from like 3 to 6 stars, and these are upgrades. You can actually get the item again, basically, and it will add a star to its rating, and it will increase its power in some way. Whatever it does, it'll do it better. It'll get stronger in some capacity. And the cool thing is, if you actually max out an item's star rating, not only does the item itself get a lot more powerful, but it also gives you an extra sort of free item choice. An extra set of 3 pedestals will show up, and you can choose one item from it basically as a free reward for maxing one of them out, which is a nice touch. The thing the game definitely does best, though, as much as I love its creative weapons and really interesting item design and stuff, is its visual style and its enemies and things. Because the enemies in this game are wonderful. They look very silly. They're all super adorable in some really weird, twisted way, and a lot of them are really creative, like these weird green crystals that float around and possess various things in different ways to fight you, and then eventually, if you run them out of things to possess, they just sort of like slam into you and explode. Although my personal favorite enemies and environments are these sort of Norse various owls that you can find. They're these weird owl beings that have all sorts of like rune-based magic and stuff like that. They're super adorable, but they're really fun to fight, and that just, I think, goes to show the level of creativity in this game in general is very high. Its overall visual style, its weapons, its items and synergies and all that stuff, the characters you can play as, all of the various facets of this game are all super colorful and creative and interesting. And that is one of the biggest things that helps it stand out in a crowded genre, is that everything about it is just off-kilter and weird in some ways, so it makes you want to play it even if you're very familiar with other games in the genre, because it's got a lot of stuff you're familiar with but made incredibly strange. So yeah, my personal view of Voidigo after its big 1.0 update, and also another community patch that added some requested features and stuff, which is always a nice thing to see devs do. My opinion of the game is that it's excellent. It is a very, very good standout roguelite that if you're at all a fan of the genre, you should most definitely be trying. And even if you don't like a lot of other examples of the genre, this one is good and different enough that you may find something to enjoy in here anyway. The overall style of its enemies and bosses and levels and stuff is just so standout and fascinating that it's worth experiencing just to see all the crazy enemy types and stuff like that. So I will put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can go and check the game out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.